Hello again. So we're going through the B's here in World of Ideas by Roman. You can't really see it very well, but that's the guy's name. Hopefully the great new neighbors upstairs making a lot of noise. Hopefully this whole setup reduces some of that problem. So I think there's only about 4 words. I'm going to try and go through them um, all at once here. Keep it relatively short. I mean, there's more words in the B part section, but again, just trying to hit some bullet points, some things that I think might be pertinent either for the SAT tests, you're going to need to know the words for that, or social studies, science, yeah, civics, government, history, any of these other sort of things. And a couple things, I think maybe just people ought to know. So this one is balance of power. A key concept to international relations, usually defined as a rough power equilibrium among states. States doesn't necessarily have to mean like United States, like we have Ohio and California. States in this regard is sort of sovereign countries sort of things. So the United States would be a state. England would be, or United Kingdom technically. Germany, they sort of mean stuff like that. This is achieved by maintaining military might sufficient to deter aggression by the other or others. A balance of power may be established between individual states of similar strength or through alliances, for example, when several smaller states unite to offset the power of one or two larger ones. It may be bipolar between two states or alliances, or multipolar among several competing centers of power or within an alliance. The term is used in other, sometimes conflicting senses, as when a nation seen as the linchpin of an alliance, or one possessing a preponderance of military force, is said to, quote, hold the balance of power, end quote, and can also refer to a balanced structure or situation in domestic politics. So it's almost sort of a I can do this to you, so don't do that to me sort of aspect. And yeah, sometimes it's, we, United States at this point, well, maybe not so much at this point, but holds a certain balance of power over the rest of the world because we got so much more money and so military budget is the biggest of anywhere, any time ever. At the expense of some other things within our country, as seen a lot of the times too, some might argue. And so we can kind of be like, no, you're going to do this or else. We're going to do something to you. And there's a lot of times where, it's, oh, well, no, you're not, because you might be bigger than me, but my other 5 friends and I encompass more things, and you're going to have to be careful with that too. Right now there's a certain, awkward equilibrium between the United States and China. Well, we might have more of certain other things. They've got more people and more willingness to kind of drive things in one sort of directed way. Um, and each of us using certain propaganda to our hands, and it's just sort of like, it could be helpful in certain ways to be able to kind of be for protection and for a sharing of resources, and it could also be kind of a threatening kind of thing, and it could also be just to kind of reach a certain stalemate. So the Cold War, we had a certain stalemate because it's anything to tip the balance of power could just eradicate everyone. I'm going to skip some of this here. So they're talking about, at least as old as classical Greek city-states. It's ridiculous that they keep going to that because it's clearly even beyond even that. Goes into some stuff with Italy, Spanish succession, all that. But I will read this blurb because I think it's a little bit more pertinent. From the 16th through the 19th century, Europe was the scene of shifting alliances as emerging nation-states combined to thwart single powers or menacing blocs. In the wake of World War I, the formation of the League of Nations was in part an effort to replace the old balance of power status of Europe and the system of collective security. I'm going to make a couple comments of that. yeah, in 19th century, a lot of stuff was going on. Italy was mostly kind of a lot of city-states, nation-states. Before that, Germany wasn't Germany. Germany was, I think, 6 other countries that kind of had maybe, hey, we're sort of, German alliance-y sort of thing, but you had Prussia and Bohemia, and I don't remember all the other 4. Um, Bavaria, maybe? I can't remember exactly. I think there were 6. But they, Otto von Bismarck comes, and now we have a Deutschland. We have a Germany now, and that sort of threw things off a little bit. And in the beginning of the 20th century, all these different people had alliances across the board, and over here with Russia or Japan and this other thing. So when we have the events of Archduke Franz Ferdinand being assassinated in Sarajevo, that kicked off that system of alliances. Where now, oh, well, I'm going to fight them, and you're my friend, so you need to fight them too. But they've got this other friend, so you're going to, and that just sort of had this house of cards sort of tumble in with that as well. While a balance of power is intended to promote stability, some have argued that such a policy provokes an arms race and inevitable war. In the mid-18th century, 1700s, the French philosopher Montesquieu criticized contending European alliance as a disease that could only lead to, quote, mutual ruination, end quote. During the Cold War, the nuclear threat of mutual annihilations or mutually assured destruction, as was what we actually said then, created a balance of terror between the United States and the Soviet Union. Also be considered deterrence. While it made all-out war, quote, unthinkable, it did not prevent conflict between the two superpowers, but merely channeled it into economic and technological competition and proxy wars in smaller countries, such as Angola and Nicaragua, civil wars in which each side was supported militarily and ideologically by one of the superpowers. Also the conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, while the United States and Great Britain and those sort of powers didn't directly fight China and the Soviet Union, USSR. It was all these different things supported. We supported South Korea. They supported North Korea. We supported one side of Vietnam. They supported the other side of Vietnam. All this other stuff and everything. And things were played out in Central and South America, in Asia, and a lot of other places. It was almost sort of a continuation of colonialism. I would also, they said economic and technological, and then using these other people as sort of just meat proxy for what they wanted to do as well. A lot of espionage and stuff like that too. Made for some fun fiction, James Bond and things like that. Not great all the time to be in actual places, in some of those actual places though. So we're going to go on to behaviorism. I think is important. We're trying to do some different social emotional things as well. Primarily American school of psychology based on the study of observable, measurable behavior. So in other words, measurable behavior is, we can write this down. Someone does A, B, and C when they're presented in these situations, and then, we can see how they behave and measure, 7 times out of 10 when they're going to this store, excuse me, maybe they get a panic attack or something like that. So this is something that we can start measuring. Again, we've talked about in other videos that reductionism in things, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's good and it helps be able to understand patterns, but sometimes it also reduces people just to this thing that we can measure. Everything's got to be measurable. The behavior of humans and animals alike is seen by behaviorists in terms of conditioned responsible to environmental stimuli and the role of, quote, subjective phenomena such as thought, intention, and emotion is either minimized or treated as unknowable and thus untestable. So basically, the only a lot of the reasons we do things is because we've been conditioned to do them. In sort of classical behavioralism, let me make sure they're not going to actually do that? No, so you kind of get, oh, they do talk about it a little bit, so I'm going to skip that. But it's the idea of you were taught to do X, Y, and Z in these particular things, so you're just going to do X, Y, and Z. In terms of, the actual parts of being a conscious being, like your intention and your thinking, we can't test that, so it doesn't kind of count. So, if you hear, just, to repeat, the phenomena such as thought, intention, and emotion, because it cannot be measured, is either minimized or treated as unknowable. So it does sort of dehumanize things a little bit, but it also sort of allows for a certain amount of fungibility with the scientists. Can be like, oh, well, our tests were done perfectly and everything. It's just we can't know everything about people. Behaviorism was born of the attempt by psychologists influenced by logical positivism to make psychology an empirical science. Empirical means very scientific. In his 1913 article, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, often called, quote, the Behaviorist Manifesto, close quote, John B. Watson heralded, quote, a purely objective experimental branch of natural science, close quote, free of the subjective judgments, whose, quote, goal is the prediction and control of behavior, end quote. In the nature-nurture debate over whether behavior and personality are determined more by innate disposition or by environmental conditioning, behavioralists came down squarely on the nurture side, so the conditioning side, because everything in our society has to be an if or and or. It has to be your behavior is all just your genes and you have no control over it, or it's all your environment and your conditioning. I would personally say it's little column A, little column B, and then the sort of subjective, unknowable, and then untestable idea of choice. Because despite your genes and despite your conditioning, sorry, boys and girls, you still have a choice whether or not you behave in one way or another. And blaming either of those things is often not going to help you. And also, if you have conditioning, as a side note, that you didn't like, as in something that would be, oh, well, my parents did this and they said their parents did that, and I really hated it, and it messed up my self-esteem, and it messed up the way I deal with men or women or anything like that, but I'm going to make sure that I do that too. You're extra responsible for continuing that cycle because you knew better and you kept doing it anyway. Sorry, it's just kind of the way it really is. Indeed, Watson and others have taken the position that consciousness is an aggregate of muscular, glandular, motor responses, and that character, intelligence, talent, and other human qualities are entirely determined by learning. So the idea of you're a conscious being with free will is just sort of an oops, this sort of biological sort of, yeah, you kind of got it. And everything else is just by what you have been taught. The behavioralist approach derived from experiments in animal psychology, particularly those of the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, whose famous observations of anticipatory salivation of dogs led to his theories of what is now called classical conditioning. I would imagine there'd be more on this later, so I'm not going to get hugely into it, but the basic real shorthand of it is he had some dogs, he rang a bell, and he fed the dogs. And then they measured the salivation of said dogs. And then they realized that they could ring the bell after a certain amount of time and the dogs would salivate regardless of whether or not they gave them food. Now, if they rang the bell and didn't give them food, a certain amount of time, what was called extinction happened, where they'd stop salivating. Or if they rang the bell and sometimes gave them food, that extinction for that behavior of the salivating, that thought to go away, was much, much, much further. So this is almost sort of the idea of you can go back and apply this even to more almost abusive things. Well, it was like, well, why does this person stay with their significant other if they feel they're being wronged or abused? Because of this, it's called intermittent conditioning now. It takes so much longer for that extinction to happen. Constant reinforcement, is going to take, one amount of time for extinction. The complete end to reinforcement, that extinction takes much less time. That, oh, I don't know, is this going to be good or bad? Is going to be good or bad? Takes way longer for that extinction to happen. So that's real shorthand for that. B.F. Skinner, by the way, the reason why the principal in Simpsons is called Skinner. B.F. Skinner's radical behavioralism, or operationism, was based on operant conditioning, in which reinforcement and punishment are used to instill a learned response to a given action based on the subject's reception of its likely outcome. So again, still conditioning. If you, you do, you got a kid and they, do a chore without you asking, you give them a lot of reinforcement for it. Or if they don't do a chore and you've still got to ask them, you give them punishment for it. In Walden 2, 1948, and Beyond Freedom and Dignity, 1971, Skinner envisioned behavior modification techniques used on a societal scale, such as benevolent tool of social control. Social behavior modification, again, that sort of similar thing. Hey, you do this thing that is good, and you get some sort of reward. Sometimes it might be like, hey, man, that was a really good job. Sometimes it might be a piece of candy or a toy, a video game. To a certain extent, paychecks, raises, promotions, to a certain extent, are behavior modification, because you're doing this thing that we want you to do, and we're reinforcing that behavior. There's been sort of a stance sort of away from that, at least in terms of what people are saying, but it's still being done. Behaviorism was the most influential movement in American psychology from the 1920s into the 1970s. Although its authority has waned, it is responsible for establishing the empirical approach that still dominates psychological research, and many of its principles are widely applied. Operant conditioning, for example, has been successfully used to treat conditions ranging from overeating to autism. Real quick, they also have the Big Bang Theory in there. Again, I'm trying to keep this under sort of a certain time. I have expounded a little bit. And Big Bang Theory, expounded, get it? Sorry. Big Bang Theory, the theory that the universe originated from an infinitely dense, infinitely hot point that spontaneously exploded, creating all the matter in the universe. When the expanding universe theory was proposed in the 1920s, one question it immediately raised was what had made it expand. The Belgian mathematician Georges Lemaitre proposed that the explosion of the cosmic egg, or primeval atom, created the universe, which had been expanding and cooling ever since. But it was not until the late 1940s that the Russian-born American physicist George Gamow and two colleagues fully formulated the Big Bang Theory. They postulated that all the chemical elements in the universe today were created in the first few minutes after the explosion, when the extreme density and temperature fused subatomic particles. They further predicted that reverberations of the Big Bang would remain today as background radiation in space. When you see static on a television screen, something like that, that is the background radiation of the Big Bang, or so the modern idea of the science says. The hypothesis was confirmed in the late 1960s by radio astronomers Roger Penzias and Arnold Wilson, and has been repeatedly corroborated. The Big Bang, thought to have occurred between 10 and 20 billion years ago, is now the most widely accepted cosmological theory, although alternative scenarios have been offered to explain the background radiation. There is also disagreement on the eventual fate of the universe. It will continue expanding forever, the open universe theory, or will eventually slow and stop, then collapse back in on itself, the oscillating or pulsating universe theory, perhaps to be born again in another Big Bang. We have proved through, I believe, redshift, the shifting of the spectrum, almost like the Doppler effect. So you hear the sound, and it's way far off, and then it starts getting louder as it gets close, and it gets back far off. They use that with color. There's a blue shift and a red shift to stars, and since most everything's kind of on, I believe it's red shift, they're using that to say the universe is still expanding out. Terence McKenna calls this the sort of definition of credulity for science. That this is, there's some that might say it was like everything in the entire universe is an infinitely dense, infinitely tiny point, and then blew out to everything that we know now. That was the sort of limit break for credulity. Just so you know that there's other things with that. It also does kind of mix in where there's a lot of mythologies, practically most of them, that have some sort of nothing or no, or nothing as in nothing, or no thing as in everything was sort of chaos, and then everything came out of that. And it's usually a chaos or a nothing, and then there was a thing, and then that thing had a couple more things, and then a couple more things came from that. So we went from the very general of everything kind of as a, like I said, cosmic egg, to the very specific as to the thing that we have now. There's almost a Taoist thought, which is a little bit more sort of numerical with that. First there was like the wuzi, or the nothing, but as an undifferentiated whole. It wasn't nothing as in no thing, vacuum, absolutely nothing. Again, it was sort of no thing, nothing was separated out. So all was a whole. And then you've got wuji and the taiji, which is that sort of a thing. That taiji separated into yin and yang. The yin and yang separated into greater and lesser yin and yang. And then you started getting like the bagua, like the 8 trigrams, and those combined. And you got the 5 elements in there, and then 64 hexagrams, and 64 hexagrams breaking into 10,000 things. And I mean 10,000 things, they don't mean specifically 10,000, they mean everything. So even with that, you've got a very general, all whole unified thing, and breaking down into specifics. All 4 of the major Egyptian sort of Genesis mythologies have that. Judeo-Christian Genesis has that. Nordic creation has that. Other indigenous things all have that sort of idea of this very general thing. Something happened, and then a progression of creation and separation out from that unified whole happens. And a lot of times the idea philosophically and even spiritually is to take those things kind of back together and go back up to that sort of unified whole thing. Whether you call it source, or the universe, or God, or the creator, or creation, or something else like that, is dependent upon you and the school of thought that you want to go by, and all that other stuff. I'm not going to get into the whole thing with, I believe that's it for this right at this point now. Yeah, because there's a couple other cultural things. Oh, no, there is one more thing. Sorry, I forgot about this. Going on, continuing with the sort of science end of things. Biological determinism. So again, we're going to go back into that sort of nature versus nurture thing. The belief that human behavior is determined more by physiology, your body, your genes, than by environment and experience, also called biologism and genetic determinism. According to this perspective, which is the basis of the controversial interdisciplinary field of sociobiology, so this is going to be kind of the other side of behavioralism, there is a direct link between genetics and behavior. The behavioralism, by the way, would also, behaviorism, not behavioralism, behaviorism would also kind of go back into the epigenetics that we talked about before. This would be actual genetics. Not only biological traits, but social and cultural phenomena are seen as the end result of evolution through natural selection. An essential tenet is the idea of the selfish gene, that individual organisms and the species they comprise are simply vehicles for the perpetuation of genes, and that behaviors that promote the reproductive ability of an individual or group will be propagated in the gene pool. So basically, the only reason we're here is for genes to continue to make more genes. So everything we do, art, science, poetry, building things, Everything we do is a way for our genes to make more genes. In this analysis, behavioral patterns such as the aggressive male/passive female dyad have arisen because of their value for environmental adaptation and survival. An example is the aggressive male is better able to hunt and fight. The passive female more readily submits to sex and therefore conception. The evolutionary accretion of these, quote, social traits results in the behavioral repertoire characteristics of the species. The term sociobiology was first employed in the 1940s in the field of animal behaviorism, denoting the application of biological theory and methodology of the study of animal behavior in societies. It was extended and popularized by Edward O. Wilson in Sociobiology, The New Synthesis, 1975, where he argued that the same techniques can be applied to human societies. Just as animal behaviors and social structures have a genetic or hardwired basis, so do those of humankind. The field now encompasses a number of disciplines in the natural and social sciences. Social biology and biological determinism have faced considerable hostility from the scientific and academic communities. Critics view the arguments for genetic determinism and psychological attributes and social roles, especially those involving race and gender, as pseudoscientific justifications of the status quo, shaped by personal ideologies and political trends rather than scientific rigor. Many feminists, for example, regard the identification of innate, quote, female qualities as the patriarchal imposition of stereotypes. So it kind of goes into what we were talking about before of the idea of people trying to hijack what they consider to be science as proof of kind of being a bit of a bastard. So they have it where people have used this idea to be really not good people to people of other ethnicities, and as well as to women. They're like, oh, well, since I'm stronger, then I can just do this. Or since our society created, the engine and cars and airplanes, we are therefore better than your society that didn't do that. Or even in the 19th century, it was like, oh, look, we've got the steam engine, we've got bigger guns, so therefore we're, obviously better than you. So it is, we're using science to determine that. So, we can use that to rationalize the rape, rob, and pillage of your country and way of life. So that had been kind of co-opted a lot with that and used as a reason, as an excuse. Some people also use this as a sort of bastardization of what's considered Darwinism, that whole survival of the fittest thing. Let's be clear about something. What is considered survival of the fittest and just kill or be killed, the law of the jungle thing is not what Darwin was trying to get at all. And I'm sure there'll be other stuff we can talk about that with too. But just to kind of juxtapose that a little bit, it was species will adapt things that will help them better be able to be part of this sort of environment and ecosystem that they're in. Not to be better at killing or sex or anything like that, but it's going to be, the mutations will happen in order to sort of fit the environment better. His thing is not necessarily who's the strongest or the fastest or even the most intelligent. It's who's best able to adapt to the situations. And that's more Darwinism. But people would bastardize that with this sort of biological determinism. It's like, nope, I'm this way, and I can apply this to our society, so that makes me and our society better, therefore, than you. And it was used in all over the place. So we kind of did a few things with that, including kind of both sides of that extreme nature, which would be the sort of biological, genetic, socio-biological determinism, and extreme nurture, which would be the behaviorism, which was it's all just the epigenetics in your environment. I would challenge you to think that in pretty much all human experience, it's the blend of the two that really makes things actual reality, as opposed to trying to specify everything as it is, and therefore that specificity tends to blind us to everything else. Even in terms of healthcare, you might have someone who's a great heart surgeon, but ask them about anything else, and maybe it doesn't work out. And they might know the heart so well, but maybe they don't really understand so much how the heart might affect other organs in the body if they're messing with the heart too much in some way, because that specificity, and then we start getting people butting heads. Anytime you have separation of that, where it's all this or it's all that, or it's all us versus all you, you're going to have issues and problems. Even when you start getting into talking about, even within the same government, you had, think of September 11th, we had the CIA or the DEA or the FBI or these people in this country, everyone had little bits of the thing, but because everyone was so, I'm going to stay in my little thing, no one talked, and bad things happened. I read Helter Skelter about the Charles Manson crimes, and they'd even said that they had these different task forces for the different crimes, and no one talked to each other. So all this stuff could have been cleared up long before, and maybe other things could have happened or been saved, or people and all the evidence to connect these things were within 5 feet of each other for days or weeks or months, and no one put them together because everyone was just like, no, this is mine. No, this is mine. Or, that's stupid. I'm not doing that. So, this sort of thing I want you to think about in conversation piece, besides the fact that, again, these things are going to come up in classes or tests, but also try to think about, even with yourself, where you lie on those spectrums, in your thoughts and your actions and behaviors, those of the people around you, and we're in sort of a petri dish of that now. We're supposedly kind of coming to the end of that petri dish now, as it is mid-May of 2020. But we've now had 2 months of of a lot of data, personal data, to collect not only in our own behaviors and thoughts, by the way, which lead into behaviors, but also the people that we're around regularly, or maybe the people we're not around regularly, and we have time to think about that now too. So again, I would also challenge people to remember that if we do live in a reductionist mentality mindset here in this country, to try and be like, okay, well, maybe it isn't all that. Learn what you can from these different things and make up your own mind for what's going on. Collect as much information and data, read both sides, try and understand both sides in certain aspects. There are some things where it's like, no, this is wrong. Especially if the other mindset is somehow preaching, or their whole thing is, it's all this other type of person's fault, or this other type of person is bad. I don't know if you really need to understand that, other than that I understand that maybe they're attacking people really horribly. Their existence might be threatening other existence to a certain extent. But that, even though we kind of went over the sort of quanta of terms that we use for this, were mostly put together because of where they are in the alphabet. It worked out, especially skipping around, that they had some other connections and ties in with that too. So I would lay that at you guys to kind of take a look at and think about. And that's it for the bees right now. Thank you.